In the beginning, man believed flight to be the privilege of mythological gods. The gods of Crete, of Egypt, of Assyria, and of Greece. As man's capabilities developed, so developed his power to dream of his own ability to fly. Leonardo da Vinci, whose genius stands in marked contrast to the ideas of his contemporaries. If it were not for the dreams in his fertile mind and the dreams in the minds of generations that followed, there would have been no tomorrow. Throughout history, throughout the world, the achievement of sustained, controlled, and powered flight eluded man. The dream was there, but never fulfilled. Sir George Cayley, with his revolutionary wing designs, solved the problems of lift. Steam and clockwork planes followed in 1857. Mosaiski's 1884 steam plane almost succeeded. Then, in 1903, the Wright brothers flew and created fresh dreams in the minds of the young. In the struggle to realize the dream of vertical flight, one man stands out as a pioneering giant, Igor Sikorsky. He was the first man to design, build, and pilot a multi-engined aircraft. He held, during his long career, 10 world records, both as a pilot and designer. But above all, it was his dream of vertical flight, which he eventually realized, that made him the father of the modern helicopter. Is now such an essential part of our modern life that it's difficult to imagine that it has been with us for only 40 years. Its uses, as Sikorsky predicted, are boundless. Rescue, transport, supply, construction, and latterly as a highly sophisticated combat machine. Looking at it now, it seems remarkable that its designer was already a young man when the Wright brothers first flew in 1903. Remarkable also because he built his first prototype helicopter in his backyard in 1909, and that it was built not in the advanced countries of the West, but in the relatively backward Russia. In fact, Sikorsky confounded his critics, his circumstances, and on occasion, death. to build a company that has become the largest single producer of helicopters outside the USSR. Igor Sikorsky was born in Kiev in 1889, the youngest of 4 children, and came from a respected middle-class family, his father being an eminent child psychologist. From the beginning, his family encouraged his interest in the modern technology that was beginning to filter through into Russia, and as a result spent several years studying engineering at the Naval Academy in St. Petersburg. But the strongest influences on his early years was his fascination with manned flight, an obsession that was to shape his whole life.
When my father, Igor Sikorsky, first began to dream about aviation, aviation as such did not exist. His first interest in aviation was sparked by the drawings of Leonardo da Vinci describing the helicopter and also describing various flapping wing mechanisms to allow man to fly. His dreams of flight were then, I believe, crystallized in a uniquely prophetic dream that he had at the age of 12. And if I may, I'd like to very, very briefly frame it by saying that at that time, in 1900, man had not yet flown. We were 3 years away from the Wright brothers. And this 12-year-old boy had a dream. And in this intense photographic dream, this 12-year-old boy in Kiev, Russia, sensed himself walking down a very narrow, wood-paneled cabin, strangely vibrating, somewhat like a fast-moving boat or railway car, but not quite. In his dream, this 12-year-old boy walks to the window, looks out, and is paralyzed with amazement and with fright and with joy as he sees himself in a flying machine looking down at a green coral sea, white sands, and palm trees. The dream woke him up bolt upright in his bed. The dream stayed programmed in his mind, and it was that dream, possibly more than anything else, that began to set my father's mind to try to solve the challenge of flight.
It was in 1908, whilst on holiday in Austria with his father, that Igor first saw news film of the first public demonstration of the Wright brothers aircraft. This early footage had a profound effect on his fertile mind, which made him determined there and then, at the age of 19, that he too would one day fly. It was a difficult task to convince his parents to send him to Paris, the focal point of European aviation pioneers. Eventually, they consented, and in spring of the following year, the first steps to fulfilling his dream had been made. Surrounded by the exciting atmosphere of that early Paris air show, he soon established contact with many of the pioneers of flight, developing a special relationship with Ferdinand Faber, who advised him to enroll at an aviation school near Paris. Although he was never allowed to fly, he learned an immense amount by watching pilots and engineers checking the rigging of their aircraft, tune up the engines, and test the new prototypes.
It was, for my father, an intensely dramatic period of time. Today, we take these things for granted, but my father was there in 1909, and he says that very, very often when one of these great French or British pioneers would be flying, the crowd, consisting of grown men and women, would be so emotionally affected that great, strong men would be standing there with tears of joy and pride running unheeded down their cheeks because of the fact that an age-old dream of mankind was suddenly coming true. Man was flying. He went back to Russia and started to build his first dream machine, the helicopter. Today, in retrospect, we can certainly have predicted that the machine, the first helicopter, would not fly. It was powered at that time by a 25 horsepower Anzani engine. Today we know that that is far too little horsepower. He built his first helicopter with his own hands, tested it in the backyard of his home for several weeks, eventually reluctantly decided it would not fly. The horsepower just was not there. He then built a second, somewhat more sophisticated helicopter which he tested in the spring of 1910, this machine was also incapable of flight. He then temporarily postponed his first love, the helicopter, and switched to fixed-wing aircraft. He designed his first airplane, the S-1, and with a twinkle in his eye, he would often say that he designed his first airplane without knowing how to design it, and then he built it without quite knowing how to build airplanes. And then he climbed aboard this machine, sat down in the pilot's seat, opened up the throttle, and tried to take off and fly without ever having had even 1 minute of flight instruction in his life. The results were rather predictable. His first machine never actually flew except for one brief exhilarating moment when it was lifted by a gust of wind. S2, S3, S4, S5 all followed. In the space of 2 years, this man, surviving innumerable crashes, constructed, designed, built, and then flight tested something just over 7 basic designs before he finally taught himself to design aircraft, taught himself the hard way how to build them, and taught himself the very, very hard way of how to fly the aircraft.
Despite early setbacks, Sikorsky's S-series went on to be highly successful, the 6B winning first prize in a military aircraft design competition in 1912. But Sikorsky's resources were running out. All his early aircraft had been financed with his own money, and it looked as though his prospects in the still backward Russian aviation industry were limited. However, in the summer of 1912, Shidlovsky, the head of the Russian Baltic Wagon Company, offered Sikorsky the position of chief designer at his new aviation plant in St. Petersburg. Now with backing, Sikorsky built a series of single-engined aircraft, with the highly successful S-10 floatplane and the S-11 monoplane taking first and second prize at the International Aircraft Competition in St. Petersburg in 1913. It's indicative of Sikorsky's personality that he wasn't satisfied with these achievements, and after a near-fatal crash, he began to consider a new and innovative idea.
It was then, in a moment of inspiration, that he decided that aviation really, sooner or later, had to do the next great technical impossibility. An airplane had to be built with more than one engine, with 2, possibly 4 engines, and capable of maintaining flight after the loss of one of these engines.
Sikorsky quickly began to draw up specifications for his new design. The technical problems were vast. An aircraft of this size had never been attempted before, and many European flyers pronounced it as inherently unstable. But despite his critics, Sikorsky approached his employer, Shidlovsky.
It was a dramatic evening on the September 17, 1912. When, after making a long flight and participating at each time in the military competition in St. Petersburg, I addressed this man and tried to persuade him that if we win the competition, we should take the prize and build the first big multiple-engine airplane. Now, I stopped several times, trying not to fatigue my host, but anyway, he encouraged me, go on, go on. So I went on, told more about the possible characteristic of this airplane, and finished my talk at midnight, saying that if we win the competition, let's spend the money on the construction of a big airplane. My host stood out and firmly stated no. Begin the construction of a big airplane immediately. The job I had of us was a difficult job. There were no material at that time. There were no wheels available for an airplane of this size. There were no such thing as the high steel wires. So we had to improvise. High steel wires could be received from a piano factory as actual piano chords, and so forth and so forth. So, briefly, the big airplane was built in spite of the doubts expressed by many observers. Most predicted failure. The ship was built. The ship made the first successful flight on May 13, 1913, and it was the first successful 4-engine airplane in the world. And for the next year and a half, I happened to be the only pilot.
The Grand was an immense technical breakthrough in the history of manned flight and proved conclusively the advantages of multi-engine aircraft. And although production of his smaller planes went on, it was the development of heavy aircraft, that was to continue to fascinate him. The Grand itself attracted worldwide attention, and although ridiculed in the West, it became the focus of national pride in Russia. Tsar Nicholas himself inspected the Grand in the summer of 1913, giving Igor a timepiece as a memento of his gratitude. In its short career, the aircraft was continuously employed in exhibition flights, demonstrating its unique ability to sustain flight with 2 of its engines shut down. Tragically, the Grand was destroyed on the ground before it was a year old, when an engine fell from an aircraft flying overhead and smashed through the Grand parked below.
Igor Sikorsky was already at that time busily constructing a much larger, much more improved version of the Grand. This is the beginning of the Ilya Muromets saga, the large 4-engined bombers that he built for the Imperial Russian Air Force from 1914 to 1917. These aircraft were, at that time, the largest, heaviest, and longest flying bombardment aircraft in the world.
The achievements of Sikorsky's Ilya Muromets series have been all but forgotten in the West. From 1913 to 1917, some 70 machines were built, arguably the most advanced aircraft to fly in the war. Sikorsky gathered around him a talented group of designers, Tupolev, Ilyushin, and Polikarpov, all of whom stayed in Russia and had distinguished aviation careers. The impact of these heavy bombers on the Russian war effort was limited by the massive nature of the Eastern Front and by the incompetence of the High Command, who insisted on mimicking Western techniques of air combat based around the small fighter. However, the aircraft carried out many successful raids and set several new world endurance records. As the war progressed, the political situation in Russia deteriorated. Wage cuts, food shortages, and the continued failure of the Russian establishment to find a solution to the debilitating war caused a spate of strikes. Aircraft production was halted as the war effort ground to a halt, and the desperate Russian government failed to act decisively.
In the late fall of 1917, the Bolshevik Party staged a coup d'etat and took over power. And almost immediately after taking over power, a great number of prominent people and high officers began to be publicly executed as enemies of the state or as oppressors of the working class. And included in them were a number of pilots from the Ilya Muromets squadrons who were shot quite simply for no other reason than the fact that they were officers and in a way representing the old Tsarist regime. It became very clear to my father that his own life was in terrible, terrible danger. And this impression became even more positive. The threat became even more visible after a number of his closest comrades in the squadron of heavy flying ships were executed by the Bolsheviks. It was then that my father decided, reluctantly, that there was no other way to save his life than to leave Russia. He traveled to Murmansk and took passage on a British freighter, I believe the Oporto, and landed 1 week later in England, a free man.
In England, Sikorsky attempted to interest the authorities in his ideas, but he met with indifference, most likely because of the entrenched prejudice against the so-called backward Russian aviation industry. Later that year, he left for France, where he met with more success, when the French government commissioned him to design and build heavy bombers. He was only a week away from flying his first prototype when the armistice cancelled the project. Later that year, he left France for the USA, hoping, along with other refugees, to build a new life. Having arrived in New York in the spring of 1919, he spent the following 3 years trying to convince the established aircraft companies of the worth of his designs. He failed, and as a result, decided to start out on his own.
After some initial difficulties in 1923, my father was able to collect some $800 in cash and some $2,000 in very questionable promises. And a small group of some 12, mostly white Russian refugees, decided to donate their labor, and they started to build the first aircraft in the United States. It was built largely in the open air on a chicken coop just bordering Roosevelt Field in Long Island. When the aircraft was finally completed, it was one of the larger transport aircraft, twin-engine transport aircraft. It could carry up to 12, I believe, passengers in a large and roomy cabin. This machine was eventually sold to a very famous racing pilot named Roscoe Turner, who barnstormed all around the United States with it. And eventually, when he was wondering what to do with it, he received a telegram one day from a gentleman named Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes bought this, the very first aircraft built by Igor Sikorsky in the United States, disguised it as a German bomber, and purposely crashed it in an aviation epic called Hell's Angels.
After a long struggle marked by severe financial difficulties, Sikorsky Aircraft scored its first commercial success with the S-38 amphibian, which first flew in 1928. Demand for the aircraft was so great that Sikorsky had to move to larger premises in Connecticut. In that same year, his company was bought out by the United Aircraft Company, providing much-needed financial support while leaving him in control of the subsidiary. The early 30s saw the boom in flying boat production, as this seemed to be the solution to transoceanic aviation before long runways were built. Sikorsky, already familiar with large multi-engine aircraft design and backed by influential names like Lindbergh, decided to enter this rapidly expanding field.
We built a flying boat. It was a good one, called S-40 flying boat. And by the way, this is this model here, which hangs over my head nearly. I was among the passengers during the first flight of this boat from Miami to Kingston, Jamaica, Barranquilla, Colombia, and Panama Canal. The head of the expedition and chief pilot was Charles Lindbergh, and I had a great chance, and I would say privilege, to spend a great deal of time with him, to learn to respect and admire this man in every respect, in every connection, tremendously. So every evening we were sitting together with Lindbergh on a table with the rest of the crew, in which he and I were usually taking the menu, turning it upside down and starting to make sketches or plans or specifications for a transoceanic flying boat. We both believed that transatlantic flying is possible. At that time, a flying boat seemed to be the right solution, and we hoped and believed that it can be done. Consequently, when we came back from this trip, Lindbergh and I decided that he will sell the idea to Pan American Airways, which may have had it anyway, but Lindbergh was the advisor of them, and I would do similarly to United Aircraft, insisting that we take a job like that, because I believe that we can fulfill the contract.